for your great efforts in helping the city of Los Angeles.
5 employees from the Bureau of Engineering who have served as disaster service workers.
So on behalf of the 4 million residents we all serve.
Start the system and go ahead.
Good evening. This is Dr. Howard C. Mandel, the president of the Los Angeles City Health Commission. I welcome the public and all who are watching this Zoom commission meeting. I apologize for not being in City Hall, but given the worldwide pandemic, in the order of public safety, we have elected to continue to do Zoom meetings. Please accept our apologies if it is not as smooth as we would like. Logistics are not necessarily the easiest thing to do for complex meetings. However, with that, could we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Mandel.
Present.
Commissioner Grimmig.
Present.
Commissioner Osei. Commissioner Osei. You need to unmute yourself, Commissioner Osei. I see her on. Commissioner Avila, I believe is not on. Commissioner Estrada is not able to join us. Commissioner Historic.
Here.
Commissioner Cato. Commissioner Kaito.
Okay.
Commissioner
Present.
Kalfani. Commissioner Kalfani.
Present.
Commissioner Lemus.
Present.
Commissioner Shannon.
Present.
Commissioner Sirota.
Present.
And Commissioner Whittington is not with us. We have a quorum.
Thank you. And I'd ask everybody to mute themselves if they're not currently speaking. Do we have anybody from public comment or anybody from the neighborhood councils to speak?
Thank you, Dr. Mandel. We currently have 2 public comments.
So
begin.
Seeing nobody from the neighborhood councils, we'll go right to public comment. Thank you.
I will now welcome our first speaker. Good evening, speaker. You are on the line with the Los Angeles City Health Commission. Please state your name and the agenda item you are speaking on.
Hi, my name is Laura Natoli from AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I am doing general public comment.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Laura Natoli from AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I thank you for continuing to meet during these hectic times. The health of LA cannot be understated. So I ask that you continue to support programs that provide for LA's homeless population. 2/3 of respondents during the 2020 homelessness point in time count experienced homelessness for the first time during 2019. And 59% of them had cited economic hardships as the reason for this happening. And now 2020 has found us in the middle of a pandemic, and it is certain that the rates of homelessness will continue to rise. And now with unemployment rising and the moratorium in place, we kind of have no idea how many Angelinos will soon find themselves unhoused. So I hope that the City of Los Angeles is working to support community partners to ensure that those experiencing homelessness are protected. Thank you.
Thank you for attending. Next speaker.
Good evening, speaker. You're on the line with the Los Angeles City Health Commission. Please state your name and the agenda item you are speaking on.
Program in place, we kind of have no idea how many Angelinos will soon find themselves unhoused. So I hope that the City of Los Angeles is working to support community partners to ensure that those experiencing homelessness are protected. Thank you.
Those are all the speakers for now. So thank you for the public comments. That was our last speaker. President Mandel, you may now proceed with the first agenda item. Please state your name and the agenda item you are speaking on.
Are we clear with public speakers? I think we are.
Yes, we're clear.
Okay, then we could turn off the portal, please, for that. And I want to publicly thank the two speakers for coming up and attending us, and for all other individuals who are watching this in real time. Please note that the Los Angeles City Health Commission welcomes your input and loves to have you attend and participate in our meetings. Seeing no other individuals from the public for comment, we'll move on to agenda item number 1.
You are muted.
I'm thrilled and honored to introduce to the City of Los Angeles Andrew Barnes, who is a New Zealand entrepreneur, philanthropist, visionary, as well as the founder of Perpetual Guardian, author of the 4-Day Week, and is going to grace us from the United Kingdom, where he is working on the topic of 4-day work weeks. Thank you very much for attending. We truly appreciate you staying up till 2 in the morning to present to us. We're honored that you would come halfway around the world to meet with the people of Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will just, if I may, put the presentation up. Right, now hopefully everybody can see that. The 4-day week journey for me started a couple of years ago when I read a series of articles in the UK Economist magazine, and what they discussed was the lack of productivity specifically in the United Kingdom and Canada. And under these two articles, it said that the Brits were only productive for 2.5 hours a day, and the Canadians for 1.5 hours a day. And that got me thinking as to whether, in fact, that was happening in my business and what were the reasons for that. And so I decided over a period of time to test and implement the concept of working a 4-day week in my business. Now, when I started out with this, I thought that this would be an interesting experiment in my own company. And here I am, 2.5 years later, talking to you. But actually also, this is a story that has played across the globe. It's been covered so far in about 85 countries worldwide, with a global audience now approaching 5 billion people. Now, the important thing for this is that this is an issue that transcends borders and cultures. And the US has particular differences, but fundamentally, it's not at a disadvantage from the rest of the world as regards productivity. If there is a problem in the United States about implementing something like the 4-day week, it's because of the work culture, the employment legislation, and possibly some arbitraging of regulations and contributions. And I'll come to that a little bit later. So the starting point for me, however, was that this had to be a conversation about productivity. Quite often when we talk about 4-day weeks, we put it in the context of work-life balance. And my concern with that was that quite often those experiments have failed, because when it came to putting it into organizations, unless you could demonstrate very clearly that there was not a productivity reduction, then for most of the time, these experiments have failed. And they had been tried across the world in different jurisdictions. You'd seen them, for example, in Utah had tried it as far as I think their public services are concerned. There have been experiments in Sweden, notably in Gothenburg. So what I did was I came back to my people and I said, actually, I need to have a productivity focus. And what we talk about the 4-day week, we really are talking about what we simply call the 100-80-100 rule. So that is, we pay 100% of people's income, normal 5-day income. They only have to work 80% of the time, provided we get 100% productivity. Another way of looking at this is that what we're really talking about is reduced hours working, and also that we are paying critically for output. We're not paying for time. Now, I think it's a truism in most businesses, and I think it happens whether you are in manufacturing businesses or whether actually you're in service industries, that 9 times out of 10, we use time as a surrogate for productivity. And in fact, one of the things that underpinned my own experiment was that I recognized very, very quickly that actually I didn't really understand productivity in my business. Now, if in fact my people, like the Brits, had only been productive for 2.5 hours a day, my reasoning was that actually they only had to be 45 minutes more productive in each of 4 days in order for me to get the same level of output. Now, of course, if you were Canadian, that was down to 18 minutes a day. And so the question for me was, why was that happening? What was going on in my business that potentially meant that we were not as productive as we could have been? And if we could eliminate that busyness, that lack of productivity, that then gave us an opportunity to deliver something to the employees which was incalculable in value, and that was having more time. So what we did is we initiated a trial in my business, which was Perpetual Guardian. Now, to put that in context, Perpetual Guardian is New Zealand's largest statutory trust company. We look after somewhere in the region of about 220 New Zealand dollars billion of assets, largely on behalf of the varying capital markets players in New Zealand. We're also the largest philanthropic trustee and the largest private client trustee in the country. And we have a network of offices across the country. It means essentially we are a retail business, but we also exhibit certain characteristics. We have call centers. We are a classic multifaceted financial services, legal services business, but we do have retail outlets that have to be open 5 days a week, normal commercial hours. And so at the beginning of 2018, we initiated what was a 3-month process. The first thing that we did is we went to the staff and we said, we've got this idea. And the idea is we want you to do your job in 4 days, but we will not reduce your pay. We will pay you for the full 5 days. There were some very simple guidelines. First of all, productivity and customer service had to be absolutely at the top of the agenda. The second thing was that, if I was being honest, I had absolutely no idea how to do this. And so what I did was I went to the team and said, I want you to tell me what you are going to do differently so that you can do your job in 4 days rather than 5. We were very clear. It had to be an opt-in process. You had to want to do this. We could not force you to do a 4-day week. And we also said that what we wanted you to do was to choose the day that you had off. Now, the reason for that is because we were a retail house, we couldn't close our offices. We had to continue to service the customers, and therefore we had to have a rolling program of days off. Now, in fact, this has subsequently evolved, in that as we implemented the 4-day week, we have people who take a day off, we have people who take 2 half days off, and we also have people who work 5 days but compressed hours. The key point is that we are looking for a reduction in the amount of hours that people work. This isn't about 4 longer days rather than working 5. What we also did, and I think this probably was the differentiator for the Perpetual Guardian trial over everything else, is that we brought academics in alongside the trial process. And we wanted them to do a qualitative and quantitative research of the impact on the business and on our staff, because a key point for us was, will our people be okay if we implement this program? Now, from my point of view, having academic validation also meant that I had broadly de-risked the implementation of a 4-day week. I was able to prove to my independent shareholders, I was able to prove to independent directors that actually this was of benefit to the business and our employees. Now, I think I'll now walk through a little bit of the results that you see. And so, first of all, what we found is the engagement scores. So that's empowerment, enrichment, enthusiasm. Those scores went up 40%, 40%, to levels which the researchers said were the highest they had ever seen in New Zealand. The stress levels dropped 15%. And critically, we found that our job performance was maintained. In fact, overall productivity, and this is a theme which I think you will see across companies that introduced the 4-day week, that overall productivity actually improved about 25%. The organization became far more resilient. Now that ultimately became very critical for when we were facing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a much stronger shared commitment to purpose. The organization overall was increasingly creative. The staff were very engaged. Now, when we look at what happens when you introduce this outside us, as I said, our own productivity improvement was about 25%. But the poster child for this, as far as the United States is concerned, is that many of you may well have read about the experiment conducted by Microsoft in Japan, where they also introduced a 4-day week on a trial basis, and they saw a 39.9% improvement in productivity. Now, that was done off the back of 3 things. They required people to use Microsoft Teams. They said no longer more than 5 people in a meeting, and no meeting to last more than half an hour. Now, just doing those 3 simple things delivered a substantial improvement in productivity. And in essence, this is what we are trying to address when we talk about, getting more efficiency in a business. When we work, there is an awful lot of disruption. So, for example, if you're working in an open plan office, statistically, you will be interrupted once every 11 minutes, and it will then take you about another 22 minutes to get back to full productivity. So what we're saying to our staff is, tell us how you would do things differently. We had quiet periods. We had reduced time meeting. We also encouraged people to ration the amount of time they spent on social media. And what we saw, in fact, through the trial is that the amount of time people spent surfing on the 5 most popular non-work internet sites dropped 35%. Now, we would have expected a 20% drop, but we saw 35%, which saw people changing their behaviors in order to make themselves more efficient so that they could get this day off. At the micro level, we found far more collaboration, far more willingness to help. As I said, more team appreciation, and then critically, a significant amount of cross-training and upskilling. And that's essentially because you've always got a member of your team out of the office every day. And you can't just leave the work to accumulate if you're going to deliver the quality of service that we look to. And so the net result of that is people backfilled, cross-trained, and that bizarrely became critical when COVID-19 hit and we went into lockdown. I'll just throw up there for completeness, the sort of impact between we were on the New Zealand average, and then after we implemented the 4-day week, we saw these improvements in teamwork, readiness for change, and team creativity and performance. Now, the 4-day week then in many ways got overtaken in recent times by the impact of COVID-19. So I'll put our performance in its sort of macro environment. So in New Zealand, when we went into our lockdown, so whilst we haven't had that much coronavirus in the country, what we actually did is lock the country down very strongly right at the get-go. And the net result of that is that we were effectively working from home for a period of about 12 weeks. What happened for us is that whilst the bulk of the country, so out of a workforce of about 2.6 million people, the government effectively were funding, either because you worked for the government, you were on benefits, or you were being paid a subsidy to keep jobs intact. And that, you qualified for that if you saw your revenue as a business drop 30%. That accounted for 2.4 of the 2.6 million people in the New Zealand workplace. We didn't take the subsidy. Over the period of 3 months, we had 2 months of record profits and 1 month where we missed a record by $57,000. Now, the reasoning for that was actually what we had done is that we had tested 2 key things. We understood what productivity was, and we'd also developed a very high level of trust across our workforce, because we then knew that people, when they were working in a 4-day week environment, could be relied upon to ensure that the business continued to perform. And so you go into a lockdown, the 2 biggest issues most businesses, most organizations had was, can I trust my staff? And how do I measure productivity when people are not there? For us, that was not a problem because we'd always done it. But actually the 4-day week now suddenly becomes critical for operation in a post-COVID world. So we talked about corporate resilience as far as Perpetual Guardian was concerned. We now have what we call the sneeze test. And that is, of course, that if your child now gets a cold, they're probably sent from school, you're probably at home to look after them. The next child catches the cold, you're still at home, you catch the cold, you're at home. And the net result of that is you may well find that organizations going forward have to plan to have large numbers of their staff off for a considerable period of time. You've also got to deal with issues like social distancing, also addressed by a 4-day week, because you are then reducing the number of people that are in the office. The biggest threat that we've had, of course, is that now people are viewing a 4-day week as a potential solution to cut wages. That is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the maintenance of wages, a reduction in the working week, and therefore an ability to share significantly the benefits of having an improved working environment. And that spreads across issues that the company needs to address, as well as broader issues for the wider society and wider environment. Now, I'll just briefly touch on how you implement these things. And the first lesson I think we found is don't overthink it. Many organizations and leaders, and I think it's predominantly an issue for leaders is that we believe we have to have solutions for everything. So the net result is you put the challenge of a 4-day week in front of a leader, and the first thing that they do is say, how would I implement it? To be honest, we had no idea how to implement it. We did something very simple. We asked our staff how they would do it. What is it that they had to change in their working week so that we could deliver this 4-day week? So you have to have a productivity focus. Don't plan too much. You need to have a structured format for implementing it. You know, I'm going to run a trial, which we would always argue that you should do. And then we're going to do some evaluation. And then we're going to look at the outcome of the trial. We're going to look at those outcomes, and then we're going to design a more permanent process. We took about 9 months from the initiation of the 2-month trial, then an evaluation period. We had a month of planning before we did the trial, which was teams working out what they were going to do. And then we took a bit of time after that to design the permanent 4-day week. The 4-day week has been permanent in my organization since November 2018. We currently have approximately 75% of the company choosing to have a 4-day week. We expect that the best we will ever get to is 85%. Normally, there's about 15% of the company that are either recent hires. They have to work a 5-day week initially just to understand the dynamics of it. And also we have a group of staff who choose not to do a 4-day week. We did a fair amount of legal advice to make sure that we complied with employment legislation. That's actually one of the biggest problems. Most employment legislation uses time as a surrogate for determining benefits. It uses it as far as the shape of the working week. It doesn't focus on productivity. And we wanted to move the conversation away from time spent and start to focus on what was true output coming from our staff. The research side was very helpful in that, because what that also did is that gave us, you know, some objective guidelines around what was happening within the organization. Now, I have to say that when I started this journey, for me, this was a very simple experiment. It was just me going, what would happen if I operated a 5-day week in my company? And I actually hadn't really sat down at that time and started to think about the benefits, at least in a broader sense. Now, some of those benefits are extremely personal. So, and I'll give you one example. I have a gentleman of about my age who works in one of our offices in the South Island of New Zealand. And he chooses to take 2 afternoons off a week. In those afternoons, he walks home, so he's getting himself a little bit fitter. He then has his granddaughter brought round, and he spends an afternoon with his granddaughter doing sort of grandfather-granddaughter stuff. And then they have a meal together at the end of that day, and then his daughter comes around and picks up his granddaughter. And when he tells the story, he cries. This is at the heart of why this works in an organization, because what you're doing is you are giving people something that they just can't buy. You're giving them the portion of their life back so that they can do things that they otherwise wouldn't get the chance to do. And that, you know, the great stories from my organization often come from the guys in the organization, because they're able to be fathers or grandfathers for the first time without the guilt factor of taking time out of the company. And so because this is so precious, They are going to do absolutely everything possible to ensure that this is a success. And equally, because the way we structure this, it's done on a team basis, so that either the whole team, if it fails to hit their agreed objectives, and those are objectives that they have signed up to, they have the potential of being asked to come back and work 5 days. In other words, this is a gift. It's not a right. You've got to think that if you don't pull your weight, it's not me that you're answerable to. You're answerable to your colleagues. Now, in the dim and distant days, I was in the British military, and it was always clear that nobody goes over the top for a flag or a mission statement. What they do is they go over the top for the person on their left and the person on their right. And this is what the 4-day week does. It creates a personal responsibility and a responsibility and accountability between employees. Now, what I thought I might do is talk a little bit about those broader benefits, because suddenly that became very clear. So let's talk about health benefits. Now, what I've got on the slide here is some basic statistics from around the world. So, for example, the United Kingdom loses 15.4 million working days per year. That's 44 to 56 US dollars billion per year of lost output. At any point in time, in any workforce in the developed world, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 have a stress or mental health issue. And that's generally occasioned by work and the working environment, including the commute. Now, we found that once we implemented the 4-day week, our sick days, the amount of time our staff took off, halved. We found that there were significant changes around the way that they took holidays as well. And we were finding, when we dug a little bit deeper, that the employees were using that time off to exercise, they were using it to spend time with their family, to educate themselves, and critically also to volunteer in the community. And these are all things that assist in actually making people healthier and happier. Now, there is some good research on this, and specifically that you find that employees that work more than, say, 11 hours a day, and that can include issues around the commute, are 2.5 times more likely to develop depression, and they're 60 times more likely to develop heart disease. And Columbia University Medical Center looked at being sedentary, which of course is one of the other problems that we have when we have people working long hours in the office or the workplace. They said that if you were sedentary for more than 13 hours a day, then you were twice as likely to die prematurely as those people who only were inactive for about 11.5 hours a day. And that was an impact, they said, that was similar to smoking. And so when we think about this reduced hours working, which is the 4-day week, the health benefits can translate quite significantly. Now, I can talk about it in the context of my own business, but if in fact you were to translate that across a city workforce or a city environment, or indeed a country, the impact on the health service, the impact upon the health of the general health of the population potentially is material. And certainly from a stress and mental health perspective, we find that individuals who might struggle to work 5 days can quite successfully work 2 days, take a break, and then work another 2. Another key one is the environmental impact. And so, transportation historically has, if you look at the US statistics, it's about 29% of US greenhouse emissions, about 135 million Americans commuting to work. Now, the UC Davis report said actually not going into work could be one of the most environmentally sustainable things you can do as an individual employee. We've seen some of those benefits as a consequence of the impact of COVID-19, but that is quite an exceptional impact. If you're talking about long-term sustainable impact on the environment, then actually simply reducing the working week or changing it so people are not necessarily going to go in at rush hour can have a material difference environmentally. Henley Business School in the UK did a study of 250 businesses. They worked out that if you implemented a reduced hour 4-day week, and they were looking at companies that had done a 4-day week, that employees would drive 557.8 million fewer miles per week on average. So the environmental impact, again, is material, and households, as Colorado State, New College, Florida, and Dickinson in their research identified, showed that households with longer work hours have significantly larger carbon footprints. And that fundamentally is around to the way that you then consume in those hours. If you haven't got time to do things like, cook a home meal, then you go and buy takeaway. That has a higher carbon footprint. Now, why that's relevant is if you looked, for example, in LA during the period of your lockdown, carbon emissions, nitrate emissions were only down about 14%. And that fundamentally is that trucks, home deliveries, actually produce significantly more nitrogen oxides than cars, about 3.5 times. So actually, if you create an environment where people are more reliant on home delivery or things like that, which often happens when you're time poor, actually potentially that will generate a much higher carbon output. Finally, I'm going to talk a little, and I'll talk a little bit about transport and infrastructure. If you are able to get cars to travel at broadly what we would call free flow, we did some work on Auckland, and what we found is that would add approximately 1.5 to 2% to Auckland's GDP. And that in New Zealand terms was about $1.4 to $1.9 billion. The benefit to Los Angeles, assuming similar impacts, would be worth between $14 and $19 billion. And that efficiency comes from less congestion. Now, in 2011, congestion cost the US 5.5 billion more hours in travel time, an extra 2.9 billion gallons of fuel at a cost of $121 billion and 56 billion pounds of carbon dioxide emissions. Now that's 1 year, one country, and that is on top of the ordinary levels of time, fuel, and emissions associated with commuting to work. So if you thought about what the impact of changing that dynamic, reducing the amount of time people spend commuting and actually making the commute more efficient, if you transpose that across the whole of the developed world, then frankly, the cost of not doing that is possibly incalculable. So what are the obstacles to its implementation? Well, frankly, employment legislation. We had to find a way to go around the New Zealand legislation because it fundamentally talked about hours worked, not output, and therefore to put a 4-day week in place that was one that we could say to employees is a gift meant that we had to finesse the legislation. Many leaders don't want to have this conversation because of fear, because of complacency, because of a lack of imagination. cows need milking twice a day. It wouldn't work in my business because you need to do things on a daily basis. The reality is if you ask your staff how to do things and what they would do differently, they are usually able to find those hacks. So for example, Gap, a retail business, put a little app in that meant that employees could change their shifts. They could trade their shifts. They found that sales improved 10% as a consequence of that when you empowered people so that they could choose a little bit more when they worked. Our biggest problem is that as a generation, we believe that working longer is working harder. And clearly Elon Musk has said, you don't change the world on 100 hours a week. But for me, this isn't about the Elon Musks of the world. This isn't about me, because I get the benefits of what my company does. What I'm concerned about is that each and every one of my employees has a better life as a consequence, and I'm sharing with them the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. Because fundamentally, the way we work today just isn't fit for purpose for the 21st century. The other issue is the gig economy. And the reality is there's a whole generation of younger employees who are getting sucked into this concept of work when you want on a gig. The problem with that is they get no pension, no sick pay, no holiday pay, no minimum wage, no defined working hours, no career development, no upskilling, no productivity, and in the case of New Zealand, no tea breaks. The reason why that is important, I think, has been brought home throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, where often it is the people at the very bottom of the pile when it comes to work that are actually bearing the brunt of the impact. My view is that a 4-day week enables you to provide the flexibility of working a little bit when you want, but in a way that doesn't lose those hard fought for employee protections, which means that actually society as a whole all benefits, because in the long run, if those people fall through the safety nets, then the bill has to be picked up by somebody. Just quickly, we have now set up an international network of consultants and a network of researchers and academics. One of the reasons for that is that we recognize that there needs to be a body of work that provides evidence at a macro level to governments, to organizations, so that they can see the benefits that attach to reduced hours working. And we believe, of course, that they are material. And the final and obvious question is, what's the worst that can happen? And the worst that can happen is for an organization, if you implement something like a 4-day week, you end up with a more engaged, more empowered, more enthusiastic workforce, even if the attempt to implement the 4-day week fails. That's the worst that can happen. The best that can happen is that you have more productivity, you have a healthier, happier, more engaged workforce contributing to society. A workforce that, interestingly, can also get the benefits of one of the things that, again, we didn't expect was the benefits from a gender perspective, allowing women better access to the C-suite, and also meaning that care responsibilities start to be shared across men and women, because suddenly it's okay to not be in the office. Now, I've done, many things in my business career. I have to say, that this is, without reserve, the best thing I have ever done. And I wish I had done it earlier. And I think the challenge for organizations is not, should you implement the 4-day week? The bigger question is, what is your biggest risk if you don't? And the biggest risk if you don't is your biggest competitor does it first. Because in my belief, this is a new way of working whose time has very much come. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. We truly appreciate your dedication to spreading the word on the 4-day week, and specifically the people of Los Angeles appreciate the fact that you travel all the way from the United Kingdom to be with us via cyberspace, and you stayed up to 2:30 in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll ask 2 quick questions, and then I'll open it up to the commissioners. Have you measured specific medical benefits, for example, documenting blood pressure alteration, weight loss, or other modifications of stress, seeing therapists less, or on depression scores?
We participated in a experiment which was led by actually one of our former All Black rugby players. He's created a new business which is around stress in the workplace, because he had suffered from stress and depression himself. And so we did some basic measurements as part of that process. I mean, we're not the world's largest organization, as you appreciate. We saw that there were material differences in stress levels, depression levels, and those aspects as a consequence of the trial. Now, I preface that by saying that we are, in comparative terms, it's quite a small sample size, but that looked to be a material change. We did see the materiality, the 50% drop in the number of days that people were taking off sick. And we also, we issued Fitbits. So again, it's not desperately scientific, but we issued Fitbits to everybody in the organization. One of the charities we work with quite a lot is focused on diabetes. And what we actually then found is that by running a Fitbit challenge across the organization, we actually saw how much time people were actually spending exercising, admittedly within the office hours, so to speak. And that again had gone up materially. So it's a combination, if I may say so, of anecdotal and some degree of science. We need a bigger sample size and probably more scientific principles to sort of definitively say that's what we were seeing, but we're pretty confident that we are seeing those benefits flow through.
The second quick question is in regards to job turnover. All institutions that are having problems with job stress find a significant number of people who quit or leave. Did you see any benefits with decreased turnover?
We have now. We didn't initially. Interestingly, by focusing on accountability, there is an element in any organization that actually isn't interested in being accountable and actually isn't interested necessarily in signing up to what you're trying to do. So we saw a short-term spike, and that was generally people who said, look, I'd much prefer to sail along doing my 5-day week, thanks. But once that had gone through the system, which was probably over a period of 3 to 6 months, we then found that turnover had dropped materially. Critically, though, the caliber of people that we could attract and then retain went up materially. I mean, we are the dullest organization in the world. We're a trust company. You do not wake up in the morning and say, I want to work for a trust company. And if you do, you need serious medical help. So we then found that people were queuing up to join the organization, not because of what we did, but because of the philosophy that we were espousing. They were much higher caliber of the people that we had had before. That then is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if you think, I think it's Shake Shack in the United States, you know, they introduced a 4-day week for their managers, primarily because they couldn't retain staff. And they wanted to have a method to find whether they could find better retention. And this applies very much in industries like hospitality. We have one in New Zealand where staff turnover at the base level is about 70% in the first year. So if you can do something like this, you will see material drops in due course in turnover and improved staff retention. Certainly that's what we've seen. Anecdotally from the organizations that we've talked to around the world, it's what they're seeing as well.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. What I'll do is now open it up to the commissioners. I'll go through the commission list that I have by first name alphabetical orders, the way the Google Doc does it for me. So I'll go down the alphabetical and ask you if you have any questions. Commissioner Hisserick, do you have any questions?
I do have one, sir. How do you measure productivity? It seems to me it varies presumably across your workforce.
Yeah, look, that's an interesting one, Commissioner. If you think about it, if you ask that question to almost any company, how you measure productivity, they would probably go, actually, if we're being honest, we have no idea. We use time as a surrogate for productivity. If somebody works 40 hours, they must be being productive. What we did is we went to the staff and said, actually, tell you what, you tell us, how should we measure you? What is it that you do in a week? And that's relevant because, you know, quite often we had no idea what the individual tasks were. You tell us what you're doing in a week. We'll sense check that, stress that a little bit, and we will then decide that, yeah, okay, that works. We will we will sign that up as being what is the productivity for the week. And we therefore got, as a consequence of the 4-day week, a really good understanding of what productivity was across the organization. We then found out what the interconnectivity was between teams as a consequence across the organization, and we didn't have that before. And my view would be that most businesses genuinely don't have an idea. Now, do I worry about team productivity? Not really. I don't need to, because my profitability is up, my revenue is up. I've benchmarked our organization against our closest competitor. We're twice as productive on a per capita basis now than they are. And then we sailed through COVID without actually any issues at all. So I'm now of the view that I can deal with this at the macro level. I don't have to deal with this at the micro level. But it's part of understanding what's happening in your business. And it's as much about the employee understanding what they shouldn't do as well as what they should do, because they're doing a whole pile of stuff in the day that actually isn't that productive. You know, busyness, the wrong sort of meetings, being interrupted, etc., etc. So actually you get an understanding of what's those dynamics, and then you'll find that you get a productivity improvement. The actual base measurement of productivity becomes less important very quickly because you can see what's happening at the macro level.
I think that the COVID experience would be interesting. I think in some ways, productivity for some workers may increase because they actually spend more time working than they do kibitzing in the office and so on. I don't know if there was any experience with that.
Yeah, look, I think that's very clearly from the conversations that we've been having around the globe. That's clearly been the issue, because effectively people are often translating commute time, which on average could be about 1.5 hours a day, and actually spending some of that time working.
Right.
So if you assume that their home-based productivity was broadly the same as their work productivity, and then you add on the benefit that they then didn't waste 1.5 hours a day. They were fresher. After all, they only had to roll downstairs and go to the kitchen table instead of, fight their way across half of Los Angeles to go to work. The net result of that is they get better productivity out of that. And I think that's clear. The big danger is that some of that is being translated to longer working hours. And we are very clear that longer working hours, has other issues. So the big challenge we faced during COVID-19 was actually to put surrogate start times and finish times in place for our staff to ensure that they were actually working less, albeit working more efficiently from home.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Grimmig.
No questions for me. Thank you.
Commissioner Sirota. Michael, you have to unmute if you want to ask a question.
I say thank you very much, but no question.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner Kalfani.
No questions, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner Kato.
No questions, but thank you very much. It's 3 a.m. now.
Commissioner Asi.
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Shannon.
Thank you for the presentation. No questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so very much for presenting to us. We truly appreciate it. I think it's an amazing concept that can be potentially beneficial to not only to the public health, but potentially increase productivity, improve quality of life, and then hopefully also have a positive impact on the environment. So I think it's something that needs to be studied further, and hopefully in Los Angeles, we can build upon your great ideas and the success you've had in New Zealand. So thank you for being with us. I truly appreciate you staying up to early in the morning. The people of Los Angeles, thank you for your time and efforts. And even though we have some great presentations later, I give you permission to leave the commission meeting and get some well-deserved sleep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So moving on to item number 2, I'm honored to present Professor Marlene Barnett, who's the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis in the Sol Price School of Public Policy here at the University of Southern California. And luckily, Professor, you didn't have to stay up to 3 o'clock in the morning. And we actually appreciate the fact that you could present to us without even driving downtown and adding to the pollution that we have in the city of Los Angeles. So thank you. I welcome you to do your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Mandel, and to all the members of the commission. Thank you for inviting me and having me here. And I am going to try to do bring up my presentation. Let me see, hang on a second. And do that. And you should be able to see that. And so I only have one computer screen, so now I cannot see you. But if the presentation title slide is not visible in front of you, please someone,
We see it beautifully. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And I completely understand. Mr. Barnes's presentation was quite interesting. I wish he could stay with us, but 3 in the morning when he mentioned that he was doing the presentation from the UK, I was thinking, my gosh, that's quite a time difference. So it was wonderful of him to be able to join us. Let me talk a little bit. When the chair of the commission, Dr. Mandel, and some of the staff members contacted me, they did ask me to talk about a 4-day work week. And you'll notice that I instantly translated that into a concept from transportation, which is telecommuting and working from home. And those aren't necessarily quite the same things, but they may be closely related. And what I'm going to talk about is what we know about telecommuting in particular, and how that might reduce driving and hence be helpful in terms of environmental problems. And I know that many of you don't know me, so I wanted to put my qualifications up here. I am embarrassed by this slide because I do believe that one should not say things about themselves, but clearly I'm not embarrassed enough to leave the slide off. And so, but the short answer, I have been studying travel behavior, which is what are the determinants of how people travel, including driving, for almost 3 decades now. And I have summarized that scholarship, including at times for some of our state agencies, the State Air Resources Board, the Strategic Growth Council, some of our local agencies, including the Southern California Association of Governments, LA Metro. So this is, and part of what I'm going to talk to you about is based on this long period of study. In terms of my presentation, I'm going to go through in the following order. Some of the staff sent me some questions in advance. And so I'm going to start by giving some brief answers to those questions. And that'll almost be like a movie trailer to the presentation. Although like any movie trailer, I encourage you to stay around for the full movie, right? We're in Los Angeles. We know the importance of that. And then I'll talk about work from home and telecommuting. In transportation, our data are really on both of these concepts, working from home and telecommuting, and those are not exactly the same thing, but we often treat them, we believe they're quite closely related. So I'll talk about the data and how the data are defined, and then talk about what do we know about how telecommuting can reduce driving. And we do know some things with a fairly high level of certainty from the literature. All our literature is pre-COVID-19. And so that's all that I can show you. And then we could engage in a discussion of how COVID-19 may have changed that. And then I also want to put telecommuting in the context of other policies that can encourage driving reduction. Everything we know about driving reduction and about greenhouse gas emissions and associated pollutants suggests that we will have to bring a large number of policies to bear to attain our environmental goals. And so I always do try to tell people we are not talking about only one policy. We have to think about a portfolio of policies. The staff sent me some questions in advance, so let me walk through those quickly and then use the rest of the presentation to tell you how I get to these conclusions. If we had a 4-day work week, would we see a significant decrease in traffic? So my caution to you is to be cautious. Telecommuting is not a silver bullet. In a lot of ways, telecommuting, and I'm going to use that in place of a 4-day work week, is a policy that has had lots and lots of promise for several decades now and has not delivered. And so I do think we need to talk about why it hasn't delivered. And those reasons would include what Mr. Barnes had said previously. The 1.8% of LA County residents worked from home as of 2018. So to give you a marker, if we were to increase that percentage 5-fold, which would be beyond any level of increase that we had seen in the past, we would get to a VMT reduction that would be our driving reduction from about 0.8 to 2.4%. Driving in the county would go down from about 0.8 to 2.4%. Now, in the context of GHG reduction, that's important. It's not nearly enough. And so kind of hold that idea in the back of your mind. Traffic reduction in places with large bottlenecks could be larger. In places without bottlenecks could be smaller. The next question, would a 4-day work week impact urban economic patterns? Would we see growth due to, for example, newfound free time? My simplest answer, and this could be nuanced, but the simple answer to start with would be no. Persons consume based on their income, not on their free time. Now, there may indeed be productivity increases, and what's happening at the firm level for Mr. Barnes are very interesting. I think the big conundrum that we're at right now is that the penetration of telecommuting or working from home into the population has been so small that we haven't been able to get effects at scale. And that's really kind of the conundrum that we see from kind of telecommuting. What might the effect be on communities, especially communities of color? I think we have to start from a caution. Telecommuting, as we currently understand it and think about it, is not well suited to communities of color. Now, I want to pause. I think it could be tremendously useful in a lot of our lower income, often communities of color, Latino, African-American communities. But if we were to move blindly forward with a perspective of how do we think about it in the present, I think we would find that we are thinking about knowledge jobs, oftentimes more highly paid jobs. Wait a minute, I just received an email. Are you not seeing the slide that's entitled questions, continued?
We're seeing it. We have you on number 3 and 4 in front.
Got it. Okay, good. Then we are on the right slide.
Yes.
My one caution on this, like a lot of policies, if we implement them the way we understand them, I do think there'd be a lot of concern that that would slant towards knowledge workers, technology workers, higher paid workers, persons who can work from home already. I think I would encourage the commission to take an equity first perspective. Think about what would this look like for retail workers, for workers who are working shift work, for workers with a lot of childcare duties, and how would you go into those communities and purposefully allow telecommuting? And I think that would require a purposeful equity perspective. What we're learning is that if we don't bring that purposeful perspective on equity up front, oftentimes the policy beneficiaries are the persons who are most able to telecommute, which may not be and you may not get that penetration into some of our lower income communities where we might get that penetration and benefit if we took an equity first approach. How far can we get with, say, a 4-day work week in LA right now? I think in the near term, we have to be very cautious. Telecommuting rates for decades have lagged expectations. Telecommuting needs to be a part of a long-term transportation plan for the region. If we could scale it, it could be very impactful. But I think we really need a clear-headed focus on the fact that to date, it has not scaled. Let me keep moving forward. The bulk of our data from the census are what we call work from home, which is the answer to a census question: what is your primary mode of transportation to work during the survey week? Studies of telecommuting are typically more focused and often go into workplaces and ask employees about their travel and work habits over several days. We tend to think that these are probably the same thing. They may or may not be. And so a little bit of caution there. Telecommuting, working from home, 4-day work week, probably a large amount of relationship, and then also probably some real nuance of difference. What do we know from the literature? From studies of employee commuting, oftentimes from workplaces, we know 3 things. We know how much employees reduce their driving on days that they telecommute. And in the box below each question, I give you what we know. And the answer is employees reduce their driving when they telecommute on a telecommuting day by 50 to 75%. That is a reduction typically in all driving. And so if on the day that an employee telecommutes, it's a big deal. Their driving drops by 50 to 75%. How many days per week will a telecommuter telecommute? Typically, it's 1 to 2 days per week. typically even people who will say they are working from home are often working from home, not exclusively, but episodically. Hence this idea of a 4-day work week is maybe quite consistent with this phenomenon we see of the 1 to 2 day per week working at home. Now here's the conundrum. How many persons will telecommute? The take-up rate, like I mentioned, most recent census data, 2014 to 2018 average, 1.8% of households, of persons rather, in Los Angeles who are working, work from home. So that is the difficulty, a huge impact for the persons who do telecommute, very low penetration rate. And when I do show you these slides, I will give you the sources for the information so that if those are made available to you, you could look that up later, and that will reference several other studies. Using that information, how much driving, or I'll revert to that with the acronym VMT, vehicle miles traveled. It's a transportation piece of jargon, but it just means driving. How much driving reduction could we get from telecommuting? Well, there is, first of all, kind of a, what I'm going to call the unattainable upper bound. If everyone telecommuted 1 day per week, kind of a maximum almost, we could get 10 to 15% reduction in VMT, which is a big deal, which would actually be consistent with getting us close to what the Air Resources Board estimates we might need for greenhouse gas emission goal attainment, the state's goals. But that assumes that we go from a 1.8% telecommute rate to a 100% telecommute rate. So I'm going to conjecture that that's not going to happen. And I'm going to say, what would happen if we knock that down to about a 10% telecommute rate, an approximate 5-fold increase in telecommuting? Still exceptionally optimistic. That would be going from 1.8% to 10%. In the past 10 years, LA County's telecommuting rate has moved from 1.4% to 1.8%. So moving that from a 0.4% increase to an 8.2 percentage point increase is well outside of the bounds of anything we've seen. If we were to do that, we get this 0.8 to 2.4% VMT or driving decrease. So the key problem is this very low amount of telecommuting. If we were to do something that would be possibly dramatic, we could get small but meaningful reductions in driving. And I think that's kind of where I would land. Let me show you graphs of the data from the census. These are Southern California counties, with Los Angeles County being the blue line. And you can see the most recent 5-year time period, which ends in 2018 from the census. You have LA County at about a 1.8% of all workers are telecommuting. And 10 years earlier, that was about a 1.4%. And you see these counties clustering right now in about this 1.6 to almost 2% telecommute range. Let's take a comparison look at the Bay Area. The Bay Area, which includes counties that tend to both have higher income and also may have more technology workers. Let's hypothesize that both of those may correlate with higher telecommute rates. You see rates that are slightly higher, but not dramatically so. San Francisco County comes in at about a 2.3% telecommute rate as of 2018, which actually showed a very mild drop over the past few years. Marin County is the winner of the counties I'm showing you at about a 4% telecommute rate, with some decent increases over the past year. I want to mention that is a caution that we really do need to take an equity first focus. This does reflect the likelihood that higher income workers are likely most able to telecommute. So if a 4-day work week were to slant in the same direction, we may have a policy that might be counter to equity. And I'd really encourage thinking, what can we do to get these telecommuting benefits into counties that do not have as large of a take-up rate. And so what you're seeing both in the Bay Area and in Southern California is that the higher income counties tend to have the higher telecommute rates. Why don't more persons telecommute? And what do we know from the literature? Well, the first reason why they don't, consistent with what Mr. Barnes said, is that most workers are probably not allowed to telecommute. Referencing a recent USC PhD dissertation from Moja Rhodes, as of 2009, only 14% of US workers were allowed to work at home, and considerably fewer did because of the common, often misperceptions about possibly lower productivity, lack of monitoring. And I think one thing that Mr. Barnes's presentation is really helpful in doing is to point out that those are indeed misperceptions, that a lot of work can be taken either at home or maybe shifted into a 4-day work week, and that in fact you don't see lower productivity, you may see higher productivity. Telecommuting might be quite difficult with a lot of jobs that require face-to-face contact. Interestingly, a 4-day work week, though, may not be difficult. And so I do want to mention that I was thinking telecommute, do your work from home, but we do want to really think about, could we allow just simply reducing the amount of work time? Shift work, irregular employment, and part-time work hours. And I want to really highlight that. If you think about policies that could facilitate more telecommuting, more working from home, or 4-day work weeks, a lot of times employment that is irregular, gig economy, part-time work, very difficult to think about how you would do that. So we really do need to, I think, put those kinds of issues front and center. Childcare needs are a big issue, and I think that would also have to be front and center in the discussion. And then possibly constraints from the employer side, which oftentimes, as Mr. Barnes noted, may be more about a misperception or a lack of imagination, but still really, I think, substantial barriers. Let me talk a little bit, let me broaden our thinking a little bit. I've talked a little bit about what telecommuting might do in driving reduction. How does that look in the context of other possible policies? I've spent the last many years thinking about and studying how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And that is importantly wrapped up with how you reduce driving, or VMT, vehicle miles traveled, in the transportation sector. And with my colleague at UC Davis, Susan Handy, I did some work that is at this web link looking at 4 broad classes of policies and how they might reduce driving. Pricing the system, infill development, building closer to the urban core rather than far away on the fringe, infrastructure and transit investment, and travel demand management, which includes telecommuting. And in this very busy slide, I want to summarize for you what we learned from each of those. And in each of these summaries, I've tried to build in, as appropriate, some links to the background research so that you and your staff could go to those links later. The short answer is that pricing is, if we could implement it broadly, the most immediately impactful policy. Infill development could be quite impactful also. In fact, in some estimates, possibly more impactful. The issue with pricing is that in concept, you could change a pricing scheme and reach every Angelino, every Californian immediately. Politically, of course, that's very difficult. But the simple answer is that if we were to convert, there was an experiment done in Portland, Oregon, that asked if they were to convert their gasoline tax into a similarly valuable, in other words, revenue neutral, driving or mileage fee, what would be the reduction in driving? And the answer is that that revenue neutral change, take the gas tax, put it into a mileage fee, could reduce driving by 11 to 15%. So just changing our tax structure from taxing gasoline to taxing driving could have a substantial effect. Infill development. A house living in the core of LA County, a household living, and by the core, I mean an area that kind of goes from about Santa Monica to downtown to Long Beach through the entirety of South Los Angeles into far North Orange County and includes nearby San Fernando Valley areas. So this is not downtown. This is actually a large amount of LA County. If you were to have a household living there, as opposed to living in Riverside, and you held that household's characteristics the same in terms of income, number of household members, number of vehicles, et cetera, that household, based on a lot of studies, would drive from 18 to 33% less. In other words, if we could provide more housing and more affordable housing for people in what you'd think of as the core of LA County, as opposed to the Inland Empire, we could be getting for every household that we might be able to facilitate a move, a potentially 18 to 33% driving. In fact, that effect could be as large as 75% driving reduction if you could add other synergistic policies, meaning better transit service, land use mixes, bus rapid transit, a host of other transportation policies. So while you're limited in terms of how much infill development you could do at one time, I do want to point out that that could be quite an impactful policy. Infrastructure. If we could double the frequency of our transit, in particular bus transit, we might increase ridership by 50%. We have large parts of Los Angeles City and County that are heavily reliant on the bus system. And if we could go in and create a doubling of frequency, the bus arriving, for example, if it had come every 20 minutes during peak hour, drop that to 10 minutes, do it system-wide, evidence circa 2004, you might see a 50% increase in ridership. And then travel demand management. We judged the impact of these suite of policies as being moderately impactful. Let me come back to this idea that I mentioned earlier. If you could get a person to telecommute, their driving drops substantially, 50 to 75%. The difficulty is that the take-up rate of telecommuting has been so small. So if there was something that could be a game changer and have a much, much larger take-up rate for telecommuting, that would be very important. Let me kind of close with a kind of call to focus on equity first, and then I'd be happy to take some questions. Like I mentioned, remember those hints that the highest telecommute rate in the Bay Area was Marin County. There's a lot about what we, I think, know intuitively that suggests that working from home, possibly even 4-day work weeks or flexible work weeks, may favor knowledge workers in technology industries that may be initially comfortable with that. Persons with few childcare responsibilities, I will tell you, in the current circumstance, USC has moved all of our work to a work from home. And I wonder, I have many colleagues who have young children who have to kind of manage both childcare and working from home during the day. I'm amazed at how they handle it. I count myself fortunate that my children are all out of college. Access to resources, broadband technology, things such as that. I actually think working from home, telecommuting, flexible work schedules have all kinds of promise. And I would encourage all of us in LA to think about how we can first prioritize getting those benefits to the communities that may not be able to work from home on their own, places with poor broadband access, households who may not have the information technology resources, or a good at-home workplace. How do we provide childcare relief? How do we think about this in a realm of irregular job schedules? So I don't mean to be negative at all, but I really think that this is an area where we want to be positive, but take a really purposeful equity first focus, thinking about the households, the communities, the places where a working from home would be the most difficult, and how do we prioritize those persons for the first and most immediate benefit from work from home policy. So let me if I can, stop the share. And if I did that successfully, I should be back. And so thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Truly appreciate it. And I would think that my vision would be to have a hybrid of both what you're advocating as well as what Mr. Barnes is advocating, potentially that there would be a 4-day work week. Some people, if we can get it up to, maybe in an ideal world, 8%, 10% of the population telecommuting 2 days. So 2 of their 4 days, they'd be telecommuting. And then the other population, for whatever reasons would not, but at the same time, we would create the infrastructure so that people could have Zoom or Google type meetups through work from home, but they're going to have the broadband abilities, and especially in communities that are lower socioeconomic class that are currently not properly being reached. So I think we'd have to kind of do that. So the only question I have and a concern I have is that because of the COVID virus, on one hand, our air is cleaner. And initially, when the community was really shut down, we had some beautiful days with a little bit of rain and you could see for miles. But if you look at a city like New York, which has a lot of commuting, both on buses as well as in their subways, their mortality because of COVID is dramatically more than ours. So in our population of LA County, say 10.2 million people, New York City has a population of 8.2 or so, 8.3. We've had in the whole county 4,955 deaths as of today, I believe. And unfortunately, they've had 6 times that number in New York City alone. We're not even including their suburban adjacent suburbs in Southern Connecticut, Rochester County, Nassau County, New York, or Northern New Jersey. If you increase those numbers, they've probably had 12 times the amount of mortality that we've had in our county for the same population. And though it's anecdotal, the probable reason for that has got to be the mass transit. And so maybe we can fix that in the future, but the problem we're going to have is there's going to be fear as we move ahead in Los Angeles for individuals to commute more. And we've actually seen, as you know, decreased numbers of people taking the buses and trains even before the COVID scenario. And so how do we address that going forward?
That's a hugely important question. I think, first of all, I think your question kind of highlights 2 things. First of all, the pandemic was what we in the academy would call a really big shock. And that does change behavior. And all of a sudden, it opens up, a lot of new possibilities. And that's one reason we're talking about this. And I always want to emphasize that I would never have wished this, that this has truly been tragic. We're at over 150,000 Americans who've lost their lives. And it's just the level of the tragedy, I'm not sure we're even able to wrap our heads around it. But I think the question, though, is coming out of it, will behaviors be different? And it opens up some possibilities for telecommuting, working from home. You asked about transit. I think in terms of the safety of transit, there's still a lot we're trying to learn. Internationally, there were heavily transit-dependent cities that did very well. Hong Kong, Seoul, Paris, London, Taipei. So I think a lot of the mortality rate in New York was awful. But I think it's going to take a long time to figure out why that was so. Partly, and I'm hearing a lot of hypotheses. It was initial, the hospital system got overloaded. I'm hearing people saying, is the virus actually becoming less lethal? I'm going to have to leave that one to the epidemiologists. I think we're learning that this is basically an airborne virus. And I think we're learning that there will probably be other pandemics. So I do think we have to really think about this. My instinct is that we have to think about airflow in enclosed places like buses, like subways. We have to think about what you can do to possibly use air exchange, ultraviolet light. And I do think we'll get much better about that. I think we will be at a point relatively soon where it'll be an education issue, where we might be able to build a safe system, learn where people may need to continue to wear masks and encourage that. And then it comes down to education. So I don't have a magic answer. I think we really carefully do need to think, though, that transit is essential for a lot of our communities and a lot of our essential workers, and that we cannot kind of say, oh, well, the answer is, what if we all had cars? Infill development is helpful. What you've seen in the history of pandemics is that cities evolve. And so the cities that are able to figure out how to adapt at density are going to have a big advantage. I hope like I'm dodging your question, but I think we have a lot to learn. I hesitate, you know, and I think in transportation, the issue of safety, not only in buses, but in enclosed spaces is a big issue. But I'm kind of confident that the engineers will figure it out. And then we have to figure out how to message that.
Well, in response to I don't think you're dodging the question at all. I think you're bringing up a stellar point. And I would think that one of the reasons we have the commission is to bring the academy to government. And so not just your expertise and your department's expertise, but also, you know, the excellent schools of public health that we have here in Los Angeles, including USC's, but also the engineers who could give us, you know, opportunity to study and look at things. And then also from the medical science point of view, you know, was there a different virus in Singapore subtype from New York? Were there antibodies that were circulating? Clearly there are. 15-18% of the population in Singapore and in Hong Kong have old SARS antibodies that were somewhat protective. So is that enough of a percentage to really help in a pandemic? And those are the questions that have to be asked. We turn to the academy to tell us. You guys have to study this in a honest, unbiased way to help us make good governmental policies. So we appreciate what you do and appreciate you meeting with us. I'll open it up to the commissioners. Again, I'll go alphabetical by the first names, given that's the way it's presented to me. Commissioner Hisarick, do you have a question?
No, thank you. It's very interesting, but thank you, I don't.
Thank you. Commissioner Grimmig.
Nothing for me, thank you.
Excellent. Commissioner Sirota.
I just want to speak about the people who live in the low income areas. They really couldn't do telecommuting, but they could do the 4-day week.
I agree, and I misinterpreted a little bit by converting the question from 4-day week into telecommuting, and I think it's a mix of both. So I think your point is very important. That and I would caution. I like what Mr. Barnes brought when he said it's a 4-day week. It's not a reduction in pay. My own opinion, I think that's essential. I would worry if we were moving to implementation. I would actually say, oh, but wait a minute, how do we think about how we make sure that it's a 4-day week and not a reduction in pay? And so, but look, I'm veering a little away from my own expertise. So let me stick to the data, I guess.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kalfani.
Sorry, no questions for me. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Commissioner Kato.
No questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you. Commissioner Asi.
Thank you for the presentation. No questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Commissioner Shannon.
No questions, but thank you for the presentation.
Oh, wonderful. The one thing I would say in again, thanking you for coming and giving us your expertise. But I would also say is that the one thing in medicine is there isn't one size fits all. And I think that as physicians, we have numerous tools in our armamentarium, and I think the same thing has to be true in what we're doing in government and in what you do in regards to transportation policy and planning, is that we are an extremely diverse county. We're in sense of just population density. We're extremely diverse in culture. We're extremely diverse in socioeconomic aspects, and there has to be different policies and procedures to help everybody so we can maximize it, because we all share the same air. And if we're spending money on asthma care, but alternatively, we can put that money in prevention and better telecommuting or better transportation or more proper infill, then we're going to actually save actual dollars that the community currently is spending to treat people once they become ill. In the same regards to the 4-day work week, if we can lower depression, if we can increase the amount of time people exercise, if we could decrease the amount of hypertension and just small amounts, if we lowered diabetes and BMI by 10%, we'd have enough money to really expand the transportation system in Los Angeles, just saving all the complications of those diseases. And unfortunately, if you looked at LA County data on mortality from the COVID virus, 86.8% of the people were basically type 2 diabetics of who died. And so we would have had less mortality if we would have had a healthier population going into it, unfortunately.
That's a really important point. This is something it need not be one size fits all. This is something I really appreciate you mentioning this, Chair Mandel, because this is something I also try to emphasize to people because communities are varied. And so some communities say, hey, we need a bus rapid transit. And other communities say, no, we don't want that. We might want a pedestrian plaza. Some other place says, no, neither of those, but I might be willing to talk about maybe if we, charged for on-street parking. That kind of variation is fine. And one of the links I gave you, if you were to Google search SB 375 policy briefs, you would go to the Air Resources Board webpage, which Susan Handy and I collaborated, kind of looking at the impact of about 20 different policies. And the intention was to kind of say to communities, there's a menu, and you can look at these and kind of pick and choose. And so, and I think sometimes people don't, they think it's more prescriptive. So I would exactly encourage that kind of thinking. Different communities, if we can empower them to kind of do what they want to do, that'd be wonderful.
I definitely appreciate that. If you could send that link to Ms. Marino at the city clerk's office, legally because of the Brown Act, I can't send that out to people, but Ms. Marino can. So she'll send it to the entire commission, including the few commissioners that unfortunately could not make it tonight. I totally appreciate your presentation. It was wonderful and excellent.
Commission President, not sure that you called on Commissioner Lemus in case she had questions.
Oh, God, I'm sorry.
No problem. I do have a question in thinking about an equity lens, in thinking about how those businesses that create a lot of the traffic through communities of color, how they could potentially be incentivized to do telecommuting, because that would be a way that communities of color can benefit directly from the pollution and the health effects that freeways can, the lot of traffic. And then with that, another question was, is there any assessment in terms of how this increased telecommuting will impact local businesses, such as eateries and cafes and services that are not going to be, getting that kind of traffic from people going to work?
Thank you. And I think if I heard correctly, you were asking how some of the businesses that are creating traffic impacts in some of our lower income communities, how those impacts might be addressed.
Yes.
the first part of your question.
Yes.
Yeah. And part of that, because of the real importance of the ports of LA and Long Beach, and the fact that there is basically a truck route that kind of comes up almost the 710 and the 110, there's a really well-known travel pattern that impacts a lot of communities along that route. And I and several of my colleagues have been studying that for a long time. And there are, gosh, the last time I looked, it was something like statewide, I think there might have been 2,000 to 3,000 premature deaths per year from particulate pollution in the state, and trucks are a primary source of particulates. So the short answer, figuring out a way to clean up our goods movement, freight traffic is a big deal. And there aren't easy answers. The fleet has moved through state regulation and to some extent also regulations the ports have pursued to cleaner fleet practices, and that's fantastic. The AQMD estimates that to meet our nitrous oxides air basin requirements, we would need to electrify or zero emission the entire truck fleet. And there are some questions on the private sector side as to whether that is feasible. But I think that's the way we're going to have to think at some point, is how do we zero emission, take goods movement to zero emissions? And I think that can be feasible. And I think in general also, you always want to look at, a lot of times in some of some communities of color, there might be localized street intersections that may have been unsafe, patterns of conflicts between pedestrians and vehicle traffic that have been overlooked. And so I think it's really important to kind of just, it's almost that basic, right? How do you have safe intersections? I'd encourage a focus on that. And then your second part of your question, was about business impacts, if I heard it correctly.
Yes, I was wondering if you had any assessment of the business impact as less people are, going into these communities and purchasing from, locally. What kind of impact and why would they benefit from telecommuting?
From telecommuting or a 4-day work week? I don't have good estimates of that. I think it's a very salient question. It's part of what I would imply by an equity first focus, is to start with that kind of question, South Los Angeles, Southeast Los Angeles, what would be the impacts in those communities? And the reason I say start there, we just, a lot of times in policy we haven't started there, and we should. We had our orientation for new students at USC this week. And, one thing I mentioned to students is that a lot of what the pandemic has revealed is other fundamental kind of social or economic shortcomings. This has not been to date an equal opportunity crisis. Lower income communities have been hit harder. Lower income households have been hit harder. And I cautioned students, I said a lot of that is because we had not done really a good job of the basics, ensuring good healthcare for everybody, ensuring kind of good community resources. And I don't want to get too specific about what that means, but I think that's part of what these kinds of crises reveal, is how well you were doing on the fundamentals beforehand. And so, I'd encourage any kind of focus that you could bring to thinking about the communities that maybe haven't been thought about first, because I think that's what all these kinds of shocks reveal, so to speak.
Thank you.
Any other commissioners have a question that I might have missed? Seeing none, thank you, Professor Barnett. We are honored that you came to meet with us. We look forward to working with you in the future to improve transportation and public health, as well as the air of the city and the county of Los Angeles. We truly appreciate your efforts and the work you do.
Thank you. And let me say thank you to you and all the community, because it just takes a lot of time, and this is volunteer time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's now my honor to move on to item number 3, which is a discussion led by the Honorable Kevin De Leon, who's the California Senate President Pro Temp Emeritus, and an individual that we are honored to have be the new City Council member-elect for the 14th District. And we look forward to working with him, but more importantly, listening to his discussion on the work he's doing currently to improve the public health of the people of Los Angeles. Senator, we're honored to have you here.
And if you can unmute yourself, Senator.
How's that? 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
Hear me now? Fantastic. Well, a couple things. One, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. On the contrary, the honor's mine to have an opportunity to share with each and every one of you some thoughts and opinions, so perhaps a little commentary with regards to COVID-19 and disparities and how they're impacting disproportionately communities of color and those at the lowest economic strata within our city of LA and within our greater region here in LA County. But I do want to say thank you very much for the opportunity. As you can see, I have my COVID-19, hair right now because I haven't had an opportunity to go get a haircut out there right now. But I've been listening to the presentations also from the good gentleman from New Zealand, and as well as the professor from the University of Southern California. We wear various hats. Right now, I'm wearing my hat as the distinguished senior fellow at the Schwarzenegger Institute on Climate Change, Public Health, and Environmental Justice at USC. And on this issue. So again, to you, Mr. Chair Mandel, as well as to all the incredible members who give their time to be part of the Health Commission, I thank you very much for your service, the time that you give our fellow citizens, the city of LA, and to all of our presenters. Thank you so much for that presentation. Now, a couple things that I want to share with you. Obviously, the numbers that we have seen, and I don't have a power presentation deck to share with each and every one of you, but the numbers have been very sobering for the city, for the region, and for the state. Being the 5th largest economy on planet Earth, there's only 4 economies larger than that of the state of California, that being the United States of America as a whole in the aggregate, China, Japan, Germany, and then the great state, our state, the state of California. So to put this in context, that means that our economy, our GDP in California is larger than that of France, it's larger than that of the United Kingdom, of Vladimir Putin's Russia, of India, of Italy, and Brazil. So that shows you the impact of COVID-19 on our workers every single day. Now, if you remember, during the early stages of the COVID-19, the contagion, coronavirus back in March, early April, the narrative was that the majority of folks that were being affected by COVID-19 were from communities within LA to be more micro as opposed to macro, areas of a higher economic strata, whether you live in the Palisades, whether you live in Brentwood and Hancock Park and Sherman Oaks or elsewhere, because of their ability to travel, globally, whether it be to Europe, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, or to the Pacific Rim, that being China. That was the early narrative, if you will. And it was only a matter of time before this contagion would migrate to more vulnerable populations throughout the city of Los Angeles, primarily Boyle Heights, which is in CD14, Pico Union, MacArthur Park area in CD1, South LA and Watts, Pacoima, and other communities that are very similar demographically and socioeconomically throughout the city of Los Angeles. As we have seen, the numbers are sobering, the numbers are tragic, but it is a reality. The empirical evidence is clearly there that the infection rate as well as mortality rate are through the roof when it comes to communities of color, when it comes to Latino, African American communities, poor Asian American communities throughout the city of LA. We've seen the data points and they're very sobering. I do wish that our public health officials would have been more proactive with regards to coronavirus PCR diagnostic examinations, not one-offs, but on a consistent basis across the board, saturating these communities with the necessary resources, as well as antibody testing. Even if we have inaccurate data with regards to antibody testing, false positives and false negatives, we should have worked with our academic institutions locally, whether it be Caltech, USC, UCLA, or elsewhere, Stanford or Cal, and working to find what is the best, most accurate antibody test out there in the market, to have surveillance, testing with regards to who has or who had the infection of COVID-19. Obviously, PPE equipment was absolutely critical. And when we also do shelter in place, I want to be very clear about a couple of things. What I call the triple wave or the triple tsunami. One is when you make the decision to go shelter in place. Obviously, it has a huge negative consequence on our economy as a whole, but it disproportionately impacts those who, your prior presentation, don't have the luxury or the financial wherewithal to do any type of telecommunicating. Obviously, when you are cleaning someone's house, you can't do it via Zoom. When you're taking care of someone else's children, or you're cutting someone else's grass, or you're out in the fields, whether it's strawberries, lettuce, cucumbers, when you're washing dishes, when you're washing cars, you can't Google that, or you can't teleconference that, you can't Zoom that. That has to be done physically on site. And because we have clusters of hotspots throughout the city of Los Angeles, where we have already poverty, we have density, we have multi-generations under one roof, whether it's the grandparents, grandmother, grandfather, the parents, the children, and sometimes the children's children, grandchildren, all under one roof. Interesting commentary from the professor with regards to the issue of air quality. And Los Angeles continues, although we have made considerable gains. The data still clearly shows, for a particular matter, 2.5 and ozone, we are still the number one most polluted city in America 10 years consecutively. And although relatively we have made major gains with regards to goods movement and public transportation, with regards to investments in infrastructure through Metro and elsewhere, Metrolink, we still are the number one most polluted city in America. And I can say this, that in City 14 alone, I have 9 major freeways. I have the 2, the 5, the 10, I have the 60, I have the 101, the 110, the 134, the 210, and the 710. That is 9 major freeways that crisscross the district like a serpent that chokes the air, the oxygen out of a young girl's lungs. So when we talk about preconditions, which Dr. Mandel, you made reference to, whether it is diabetes or any type of respiratory illnesses, we see the increase even more so in hotspots, clusters in low-income communities. So clearly the data points out that the vast majority of infections, as well as the high mortality rate, have been from nursing homes as well as assisted living. And the other half, the majority of that half, have been in hot cluster spots of low-income neighborhoods. Again, with the characteristics of poverty, bad air quality, congestion because of vehicles, whether it's heavy-duty diesel going through neighborhoods, goods movement from the ports of LA and Long Beach combined, the number of major freeways that crisscross, a given district, and as well as neighborhoods, the lack of access to quality healthcare. No HMOs, no PPOs, no HealthNet, Kaiser, Blue Cross, Blue Shield. Their HMO or PPO is the emergency room at LA County USC Medical Center or a community clinic within the community, within the district, throughout the city of LA. And also to their essential workers. They're individuals, again, to reiterate, can't Zoom, or teleconference or do Google. They have to be physically on site doing their work, to put a roof over their head, to pay for the utilities, to pay for the rent, to pay for gas, to pay for food on the table. And if you're an undocumented worker, which we have a sizable, undocumented population, there are neighbors or our friends, there are loved ones, there are family members, they are Angelinos as well too. If you're undocumented, you don't get no unemployment from the state of California. You don't get any money from the CARES Act or the HEROES Act from the federal government, given the agenda that our current president has had against immigrants since the beginning of his first campaign during the presidential election of 2016. So we have what I call a triple tsunami. The public health impacts, which have been catastrophic for communities of color in the hot spots within the city of LA. Two, when we go to shelter in place, the inability to work and therefore to be able to pay for rent. And we have modern day soup kitchen lines similar to the Great Depression in 1929. And then lastly, what I would say, the third tsunami wave is local governments, including ours at the city of Los Angeles, and governments throughout the state of California, as well as state government. Because of the lack of revenues coming into our coffers, they will be in a position collectively, not with a surgical knife making cuts, but with a butcher knife, given the lack of revenues and this huge gulf, if you will, between what we have in terms of revenues and what our current expenses are. And when they need the support, the financial support the most, is the time, moment, present, when they'll get the least support. Now, I want to give a special shout out to our mayor, Eric Garcetti, because there's two major things that he's done that I find quite exemplary and a sign of leadership. One was he didn't wait. He didn't wait for the county. He didn't wait for the federal government or anyone else to move forward quickly with regards to taking CARES dollars and saying we're going to test all individuals. Doesn't make a difference if you have symptoms or not. Now, we know how the rate has been huge with regards to those who have no symptoms, asymptomatic. And that's why it was important that he made the decision that we're going to test everybody. Secondly, also too, with the Angelino card, understanding that there'll be a lack of revenue for so many Angelinos who are losing their jobs or have their hours drastically cut and would not have the ability to make rent, let alone put food on the table for their children. He raised an astronomical amount of money from the private sector that has manifested in these cards that have been distributed citywide to many of the Angelinos in highest need just to survive. Now, we've seen the anxiety levels, the panic, the stress. We've seen issues with regards to increased domestic violence, especially women who have been in battered, violent relationships now have been in prison or jailed within the same household because of shelter-in-place edict and the impacts it's having in many of our communities, but especially communities of color. It would have been my wish that we would have obviously the PPE equipment and other supplemental resources that would have been beneficial to our community throughout the duration of the shelter in place. But, Mr. Chair, I want to be mindful of my time and be respectful to you and to all the great commissioners. I don't want to speak more out of my time and space, but I'd be more than happy to answer any and all questions that you may have with regarding to the thoughts that I just shared. Again, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation deck to share with you. I think the empirical evidence has been very clear. Again, who has been disproportionately impacted even more so because of the highly infectious contagion of COVID-19. But I'm honored and I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for presenting and giving us your insights. I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree with everything you said 100%. There are a couple points that I would like to point out that dovetails to what you've said. One of which is, unfortunately, 44% of the deaths in our county are directly related to nursing homes. And unfortunately, we should have known.
Yes, exactly.
After King County in Washington in the end of February and early March, that those were centers that we should have given proper PPE and testing to all the workers in our nursing homes in LA City and LA County. most of those individuals are immigrants and or persons of color who then go back into their local communities and their families and spread the virus out of the nursing homes through those communities. And we could have prevented the number of hospitalizations and morbidity and mortality if we would have properly addressed and tackled the nursing homes by giving support to the hard workers that work in those nursing homes both ways. So you're 100% correct in what you said. The second thing that's interesting, unfortunately, if you look at New York City, there is a disproportionate number of deaths in the poorer hospitals. So if you look at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens or Jacobi in the Bronx, those are hospitals that primarily treat the lower socioeconomic class as well as persons of color. And their mortality and morbidity in those hospitals was dramatically different than, say, at Lenox Hill or Columbia Presbyterian or New York Langone hospitals, which serve higher socioeconomic class patients. And that's also directly related to understaffed and overstressed workers who were serving those communities of need. And that's partially, unfortunately, directly related to low reimbursement of the Medicaid system to public hospitals in New York. And unfortunately, here in Los Angeles, St. Vincent's Hospital closed and went bankrupt because of poor Medicaid reimbursement. It was a hospital that we ended up then reopening, but should have never closed in the first place if it would have had enough revenues from Medicaid. And lastly, I would say that you talk about getting data. It's imperative that we get data. I would ask you and the other members of the City Council to develop a better relationship with the county. This commission has asked for data for 3 years from the County Department of Public Health that we don't get the data that we need. I can tell you that other city council members have not gotten the data they need to make intelligent decisions that going forward, we need to have a conduit directly to each city council member from the county. So you have the access to have the information that you need to better lead the city. But I thank you for your discussion, and I open up questions for any other members of the commission. I'll quickly go down. Again, I'll do it alphabetical. John Hisrick.
Thank you, Councilman Khabib.
Dr. Mandel, did you call on me?
Yes. Do you have a question for the senator?
I do. Senator, thank you for joining our meeting. It's great to have you. I had a question, or I wanted to get your thoughts on, I think one of the things we should look at, and I'm sure you do, but
thank you.
Is the education gap in lower income areas that in times like a pandemic, people being able to get the correct information in those areas are not the same. In wealthy areas, news isn't consumed the same way. Access to PPE isn't the same. But I think it stems not completely, but partially at least from, an education gap. And wanted to get your opinion on that and see what we're doing as a city to improve education that in these times exacerbates the situation.
Well, Mr. Grimmick, and I hope I pronounced it correctly.
You did.
You're on point. You're absolutely correct with regards to the exasperation, if you will. Some folks call it an academic, a gap, an educational gap. I've always viewed it, as an opportunity gap. Some folks are given, real opportunities to succeed, contingent on the color of their skin, their legal status, their zip code, and have an opportunity to succeed. Data points, that out very clearly. If you're born in certain zip codes, at a certain socioeconomic strata. Of course, we have outliers that have performed very well regardless of their socioeconomic status. So now we're in with COVID-19. We've always had this opportunity gap that has existed. Now we're in COVID-19, and as you point out very, very correctly, what COVID-19 has done is it has widened this gap even more so, especially with the broadband gap that exists right now. Who gets access to the internet? Who doesn't get access to the internet? Moreover, this has taken a huge toll on children of color, students of color, in very low income neighborhoods. The stress factor, the inabilities, to get access to the internet, the inability to access, if you will, and know how to navigate, maneuver Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, and also to just that human touch, that inability to be with a teacher, and then also to when you live in very confined, cramped quarters because your family is trying to make a living and survive. It is not conducive, for an academic, environment that will allow them to secure, good grades. It's just much more challenging. That's why I've always said that if you get accepted to UCLA, you get accepted to Stanford, Berkeley, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Georgetown, Cornell, wherever it may be, USC, and you come from Boyle Heights, you come from Pico Union, that is an extraordinary feat given the circumstances that you had to maneuver all of these obstacles, as opposed to, and that's not taking anything from anybody else, from their hard work. If you come from a higher, zip code, perhaps the jump or the challenge was not as deeply profound as it was for other children under the incredible, obstacles, still are resilient enough to rise up to the occasion. We have systematic challenges still nonetheless, but this COVID-19, as you aptly, put it, has made the gap, the opportunity gap, the chasm even wider, and it's unfortunate.
Commissioner Grimmick, do you have another question?
No, I do not. Thank you.
The Johns Hopkins University affiliated Women's Health NGO, JPIGO, has a motto that is, where you live shouldn't determine if you live. And I think that works worldwide, but it also works in the communities in Los Angeles just as much. So I think you're both right. Moving on, Commissioner Sirota, do you have a question?
No, but thank you very much.
Commissioner Alfano.
Mute. Oh, thank you. I do have one quick question, but thank you for your insight and perspective. And I'm just curious, do you have a ask of the commission? Curious of where we might be able to move the needle, or where we should try to elevate ourselves as it relates to COVID and the clear disparities that have risen as a result of where we are right now.
Madam Commissioner, you're coming in and out a little bit, so I'm going to sort of kind of, try to extrapolate your question. And I think it was leading towards data points, and do we have data points with regards to the COVID-19 disparities that we're currently living with right now? I know that our chair just mentioned a few moments ago the lack of empirical evidence from public health officials. I had the opportunity to be on a call just recently with the Director of Public Health for LA County, Dr. Barbara Ferrer, and she did point out, she did highlight some data points that, objectively speaking, were very, very impressive, data points. So the data points are there, and if you allow me to go back and check to see if I have them, and if I do, I'll be more than happy to forward them to all of you in the Health Commission through the chair. I think that we do have data points. We have enough data points. It's like I'm not quite sure if we need more data points. From, and this is just the way I'm wired, if we need more data points from Caltech, from Stanford, from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge, we got all the data points. question is leadership and how we move the policies forcefully to do everything within our power to help those communities, again, that have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. And then again, the data points have been very clear. It is already demonstrated. It's African-American neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. I don't think you need an expert to figure out why. Poverty, institutional racism, everything that I've, talked about a little earlier today. I don't think it took a rocket scientist, quite frankly, to figure this one out. And that's why I go back to what I said earlier with regards to the earlier narrative was those who were being affected by coronavirus were those who had the financial wherewithal to travel globally and were coming back through LAX infected with COVID-19. It was only a matter of time that, given all the characteristics that we know about our most vulnerable communities, that they would be ravaged by the coronavirus. And we're living it and we're seeing it in real time. And I think that's one of the biggest tragedies that I think, going back to what our Chair Mandel just mentioned a few moments ago with regards to nursing homes and assisted living, that much of this, I believe, could have been prevented if we would have saturated these hotspots, these clusters, with all the resources and just threw everything at it imaginable. Of course, we have to maintain 6 feet spatial distance. Of course, we have to always wear a mask. Of course, we have to adhere to all the very strict protocols, without question. But with regards to these cluster hotspots, how do we saturate them? I think would have made a huge difference. That's not our reality. So we move forward and try to make the policy changes that will give the directive to do what we need to do to keep our communities safe. I think I have a few minutes left, Mr. Chair. So I don't know if there's another question or two.
Yeah, Senator, if you look in the chat, Commissioner Kalfani did us the service of typing up her question so you could see it more directly. It might be easier for you to answer, I think.
Okay, I will do my best. Here's my question. Do you have an ask of the commission? How can we spread the needle to address? Okay, very good question, Commissioner Kalfani. What I would say is, I think going back to the point of Chair Mandel asking for data points and empirical evidence, I will do my best to secure those data points. It's my hope that I believe I have them based on the last meeting that I had with Dr. Barbara Ferrer, which I would say was a very good presentation. The question would be from the Health Commission, or actionable items that we can do now. Because now is the time when we rise together, when we stand up for each other, we protect each other during an extraordinary time in our nation's history, but especially in the city of the Los Angeles city that we all love, that requires extraordinary action as well. Not time to be sitting on the sidelines, but rather to be on the front lines and move with a sense of boldness. Again, kudos to our mayor and also to Council President Nuri Martinez with regards to them collectively working together to try to keep folks in their homes and not be living on the streets with the eviction moratorium when that moratorium does expire. And this is all interrelated with each other. It doesn't make a difference if you haven't been affected by COVID-19. The very fact that it's under the edict of shelter in place, that is having an impact on all of our families in low-income neighborhoods throughout the city of Los Angeles. So the action items, I believe, would be more testing, not just PCR diagnostic, but antibody testing, PPE equipment. We need to have contact tracing, which I believe is absolutely critical. Some folks say that it's very difficult to do in a much more diverse, society, like other homogeneous societies, where economically or socioeconomically, it is perhaps more horizontal as opposed to the vast disparities that we have in our country, which is very deeply vertical. But I believe we do need, very geographic focused laser beam contract tracing. We need to move forward, PPE equipment. We need to move heaven and earth, if you will, and use the power of the city as well as the county. and scale up our presence in these neighborhoods, and they have to be consistent, because this is where we're all in it together. It doesn't make a difference if you live in the Palisades in Brentwood, Bel Air, Hancock Park, Sherman Oaks, and if one lives in Pacoima and Ball Heights. At the end of the day, we're all Angelenos. We care deeply about each other. We're in this together. And this is where we have to come together. It doesn't make a difference if you're Black, white, Latino, African American, Asian American, Middle Eastern. And regardless of what socioeconomic status you're at, we need to come together as a city and as a state and pull together if we're going to move this economy forward, if in fact we're going to do everything within our power for the public health ramifications of the city. I think there's one more, but I'm going to have to sign off soon. I think obviously through the chair, Mr. Cato, as well as Ms. Shannon.
Commissioner Cato.
Thank you. I'm in your same club of no haircut the last 5 months, but okay. You talked about leadership, and last month we had a presentation from the deputy superintendent, LA County Office of Education. It's pretty disheartening. This is a month ago before schools are supposed to reopen, and he was saying out of the 400 pallets of PPE they were supposed to get for all the school districts in the county, they had only received 5. And also another thing he said was that these the PPE, they're designated for distribution, so it can't be redistributed to, let's say, the lower income areas that really need it more than the higher income places where maybe the parents and the boosters can be, preparing better for those schools. And it's and it seemed like he was just giving up to the bureaucracy. And so how can the city be working with LAUSD to help in these lower income areas where, it's vital for the future of these kids to have the opportunity, to have like even hybrid in class learning or something. That's my question to the council at city level, if they're thinking of.
Well, Commissioner, thank you very much, Commissioner Cato, for your comments. Issue of equity, which is absolutely critical. How do we best use our vital resources, and how do we leverage them? How do we maximize the value of our resources and stretch them to the best of our ability, and make sure that we focus, on those of highest need? That's where you get the most bang for the buck, and it's good for society as a whole. It is good, for our general public health. That's why it's not sometimes folks talk about a pseudo, quasi affirmative action program in terms of the distribution of dollars, which, by the way, when it comes to Proposition 16, I support Proposition 16 very much so, being a beneficiary of affirmative action when I attended University of California at Santa Barbara. But this is when we talk about the application of an equitable distribution of the resources, not just because it's the right thing to do, because strategically it is the intelligent thing to do. And the example that you just made is so disheartening, but it is real. And I've heard endless, countless stories very similar, and that shows that we're not, as being as astute and adroit as we need to be with the resources that we have. I'll leave it at that, but I thank you very much, for your question. I think one last question.
Hi, Senator. This is Commissioner Shannon. I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I just think it's unconscionable that communities with high poverty rates are 4 times more likely to die from COVID. We saw in July that within the Black community is 41% mortality, Latino community 45% mortality, with white communities at the low 20s. And so, I think there's obviously communication person, the lack of resources. And I just want to make sure that we are cataloging what has happened in this experience with COVID and the lack of resources and the lack of attention to our communities that are living in poverty or low-income communities of color. And particularly with our homeless community, where you were out there with me on Skid Row and saw that there's very little to no social distancing. There's been a few outbreaks, and so I just hope that you will work with us in the commission to not only have a comprehensive report of what's happened here, but also preparing for the future, making sure that we have a plan in place to ensure that our communities of color, that our low-income communities and people living in poverty, particularly who are homeless on the street, that we have a plan moving forward when we're moving forward with the COVID-19, but also with potential future pandemics.
Well, thank you very much for. I don't know if it was a question there or it was more commentary, Commissioner Shannon, but I couldn't agree with you more. It is unconscionable. It is simply unacceptable, and we must do better. We will do better. We have no other choice, given the catastrophic nature of this contagion. Be mindful about one thing. It's very different than had we had a hurricane, a wildfire, even an earthquake, which is regional in scope. The severity of this issue is global in nature, and that's why the impact has been so severe. It's not like all resources could be channeled and focused on Los Angeles, because it's Orange County, it's San Bernardino, it's Riverside, it's San Diego, it's Ventura, Kern County, the whole Central Valley, Sacramento, the Bay Area, the whole entire nation, the whole entire world. And that's why, this is unlike anything we've ever, experienced before in our lifetimes. And this is, again, to underscore and highlight, this is when we must really come together as Angelenos, be smart, use data, use science that drives and informs our decision-making, and sends very clear directives, to our staff members at the various levels, whether it be city, county, whether it be the state level. I won't speak for the federal government. That's another animal that's completely different, given the current, political leadership at the helm in the White House. But that's what we have to have very clear, unambiguous directives, and how we allow science and data to drive our policy-making decisions, and how those policy-making decisions translate in real-time, actions in the community. And that's what's critical, and that's where we have a huge gap right now. And I commend the City of LA for stepping up and seeing various gaps that were not being filled by other, health officials. That's a good thing, but without a doubt, going back to Chair Mandel, the city and county must work together in a very synchronized fashion. There must be transparency and open dialogue and communication, because ultimately what we're talking about is doing everything within our power to protect the residents of the city and the county of Los Angeles. So Chair Mandel, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity, to all the commissioners, who have given me this opportunity just to share a few words, thoughts, and opinions with you. I'm honored, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you in the immediate future.
We definitely look forward to working with you, and please know that we're all dedicated volunteers to help the city of Los Angeles, and we're always available for you and for your staff anytime that you want to improve the health of the people of Los Angeles. Thank you for your time. We're honored that you came to speak to us today.
Oh, thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Moving on to the last agenda item. Anybody have? Yeah, Rita. Yes.
Just a reminder that we need to approve the minutes from the last July 13 meeting.
Thank you for the reminder.
Move approval of the minutes of the last meeting.
I'll second.
Any further discussion on the approval? Seeing none, I'm all in favor. Do you want to raise your hands? Anybody opposed? Any abstentions? So I think we're unanimous.
I think Commissioner Lemus was not present at the July 13th.
Yeah, I was gonna say that we're unanimous with the exception of Commissioner Lemus, who was not a commissioner at the time, officially.
Commissioner Whittington is not an official member yet, but Commissioner Lemus was not present the last meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you for the correction. So that the minutes are approved. Moving forward, other ideas for future meetings that have not been brought up at our other meetings. Also know that you can work with our 3 stellar interns and present ideas to them, and they'll take a pulse of the entire commission to work with you to get ideas that we can present. Any comments from anybody? Seeing none, I'll ask for a motion for adjournment.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Commissioner Sirota. Thank you, Commissioner Hisarick, for the second. Any further discussion on adjournment? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Anybody opposed? Seeing no opposition, anybody abstaining? We're adjourned. Thank you for your time, your efforts, and for your dedication to the people of Los Angeles. I truly appreciate your several hours that you dedicated tonight and all the work you do for the people of Los Angeles. I totally appreciate every commissioner. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night. Stay safe and be healthy.